Inevitably, we all deal with this question or this situation at some point in time. Somebody says, I have a difficult athlete, I don't know how to get through to them. Now, this is a multi-layered approach, and this is something that's pretty tricky because as often as coaches really complain or argue about this, I find that oftentimes they don't step back and see the situation for what it really is. So I've made some notes here, and today we're going to talk about how to deal with a difficult athlete. First step is take a step back and analyze whether you're dealing with a difficult athlete or that athlete's dealing with a difficult coach. Now, I know that might strike you guys as like, what are you talking about? I'm here to make the athlete better. How are you saying I'm difficult? What I'm saying is perception is reality. And no matter what we know about the weight room and all the great things that training does for an individual, even beyond the weight room with their speed and agility and multi-directional work, the reality is some of these athletes have had tremendous success in their life and their career without these things. Maybe even some of them had really poor training practices and poor nutrition practices and poor recovery practices in the past, but they were still world class or national level at what they did. So I think sometimes as coaches, you need to step back and say, okay, am I really doing everything I can to, one, listen to that athlete, have a better understanding of why they don't like the training side of things, why they tend to be a little bit resistant to the message, why they don't seem as bought in and enthusiastic? Do we then take what we've listened to and use that to ask them more pointed questions? Now, the bite back I usually get here is somebody in the team setting or that works with large groups will say, I have a limited amount of time. I don't have time to sit there and Dr. Phil it with all my athletes. All right, I hear you. But then I'd challenge you with this. As coaches, we always ask them, how are you feeling today? Are you sore? How's your nutrition been? How was your sleep? We have all these micro interactions throughout the day. And so when a coach says, I don't have time to get to know them better and I don't have time to understand more about their background and things they're struggling with, to me, that's saying you don't want to do your job as a coach. You see, influencing others starts with listening to them. And not only listening to them, but being able to ask them better questions based off that listening. It confounds me and logic to think that there are coaches that get into strength and conditioning because they love to find ways to outsmart the human body. They love to find ways to improve physiology and deal with those obstacles. But the minute there's an obstacle with somebody's the psychological side or the relational side, they immediately think this person's not bought in. So I think you got to step outside and say, have I done all I could to relate to this athlete to better understand what makes them tick? How can you do that? Simple. Videotape yourself. Get their permission. Make sure that you've gone through all the ethical steps, but videotape a coaching session. Record a coaching session. I mean, if you don't have a camera, just put your phone in your pocket, hit record, again with their permission, and go back after the session and listen or review how you've been interacting with these athletes, either as a group and as individuals. Chances are, if you do this and you do it for more than a month, you'll see a lot of things, not just with you, but your staff. You'll see body language that's closed off. You'll hear tonality in your voice that is kind of commanding or overbearing. Sometimes it may seem like you're talking down to the athlete. You'll see all these little nuances that you realize, man, no wonder they're responding to me the way that they are. Even if it is an N=1 situation, even if you have 99 athletes out of 100 that are listening to you, something you are likely doing is turning that individual off. And this doesn't mean you treat them like a snowflake and that you cater to everybody. It just means you have got to spend more time focusing on these things, whether through one-on-one meetings or here's a novel approach. Go interact with them outside of the weight room. Go interact with them in a place they feel comfortable. If you're working with basketball players, find them when they're shooting hoops. Just shut up and listen, but get on their turf. Because we also forget that the weight room, while an inspirational place for us, while a positive and transformational place for many, to some others, it can be perceived as a threat. Some of the difficult athletes I've worked with in the past, I found out that they didn't like the weight room because they got injured. They had coaches that either didn't teach them technique or emphasize load over everything else. And so these athletes, by and large, their body got in a position that they weren't able to tolerate. There was a large degree of dysfunction and they got hurt. So now you're expecting them to trust you. Remember, trust is a two-way street. And since a lot of these athletes don't understand the training process like we do, almost none of them do, you have to keep in mind that you're trying to sell them on a future result that they may not be able to see or understand yet. You're telling them to commit and trust to a process that may make sense when you talk about what it's going to do for the good of the team, how it's going to help them achieve their goals. But for them, it's still very hard to picture what that finished project or product looks like after the training. They don't know what's going on in the neuromuscular system. They don't know what's going on vascularly. And if we try to educate them on that point, you can turn some off as well. That's why you've got to learn to speak their language. The other thing you have to understand is all of our athletes and really every individual in life fits an archetype. Now, this is when trolls would love to say, oh, archetypes, this is pseudoscience. I'd argue that you don't understand the concept well enough. An archetype is nothing more than a mold, a typical pattern of one's behavior. For example, if you say I have a difficult athlete, you're saying that that athlete is difficult on a subset of behaviors that you're seeing. So that's an archetype, right? Like another example of an archetype would be a hero in a movie, a villain in a movie, a person on social media that trolls everybody, the person that logs onto YouTube accounts and just hits thumbs down. An archetype with your athletes can be people like the Royal. I talk about this in my book. A Royal is an athlete that already thinks they're so naturally talented, they don't need to do much else. Right? People have gassed them up. They've been one of the best all the time, throughout their life. And so they have a certain way of looking at things, a certain perspective. You have skeptics. Guys, inherently, if you're a strength and conditioning coach or a researcher, we're skeptics. We have archetypical patterns of skepticism. We tend to, oh, what's the research on this? I'm not convinced that works. What's the context? Dive deeper. We have an archetype called the Wolverine, which I mentioned in my book. This is somebody that's come from a traumatic background. Maybe somebody has completely disregarded their trust in the past. I've seen an athlete that had a family member killed in front of them. And this was a person that had experienced so much trauma at an early age, it was hard for them to open up. Yet if you watch them in a group, they're not going to be the most enthusiastic. They're typically silent. They're going to go about their business. It's really easy to think that person's not bought in, when in reality, these people typically are just in their own heads. And that's what I'm saying. Understand not just archetypes, patterns of behavior, but also what we call fundamental attribution error. What you think is a person problem, i.e., this person's lazy, that person's soft, this person's not agreeable, is very often a situation problem. Meaning maybe they don't understand what you're saying. Maybe somebody's told them that in the past and it didn't work out too well for them. Maybe the way that you're saying it reminds them of a previous circumstance where somebody promised them something and didn't follow through. An everyday example is when you're weaving in and out of traffic. You see somebody crazy going in and out of traffic, you think that person's insane. They're not driving safe. Yet if you do that, you tend to think, well, I'm late for an appointment. I need to pick my friend up at the airport. And that's where we go with our judgments. Remember, our limbic system, which is always talking to our prefrontal cortex, is always making these judgments and fear-based emotive responses based on how we've adapted and evolved over time. Even when we look at people, sometimes they register as a threat to us. And this is where strength coaches go wrong. Because we're so committed to what we do, the minute we get a little bit of resistance, we kind of take that as a threat to our credibility. You have got to remove your ego from the situation. You've got to say, okay, this is the behavior I'm seeing. What led to it? What were some constraints around it? How did I behave or react to it? How does this person normally interact in groups? Which is why I'm saying you've got to get out of the weight room. You have got to change your perspective. So all in all, being able to distance yourself from this situation and say, is this maybe not a difficult athlete, but am I being difficult? Am I not doing my due diligence? Am I not getting out of my comfort zone? Where could I be pointing the thumb instead of the finger? Getting to understand your athletes at a deeper level because they all fit into these archetypical patterns. And remember, an archetype doesn't mean it's a fixed trait. You can't judge somebody based off an archetype. It just means you tend to notice under certain contexts, they act a certain way. And it's your job as a coach to adapt to that. You can't give up on these folks. Of course, time's going to play a role. Some of these athletes, they just may not be to the maturity level or the life standpoint yet where they get what you're trying to do. And that's why Bruce Lee always said that the teacher appears when the student is finally ready. But you can certainly never quit trying. Guys, if you want to learn more about this, make sure to look down in the comments section. I have links for books and articles and tons of other stuff on this topic. Feel free to debate. I want to hear your take in the comments. Can't wait to see you next time.